origin of modern painting is really an extraordinary book. The more so for being the first one of the author. It absolutely lives up to the high stakes set up by its ambitious title. And it is also a great pleasure to read. One learns a lot from it, but one also reads it with great pleasure because of the way in which it is written. Now, as a lot of you might know, Courbet is actually better known for his grand figural compositions, especially the breakthrough canvases of the 50s, such as the Stonebreakers of 1849, now regrettably lost, the Burial at Rouen of 1850-51, and the Painter's Studio of 1855. These were remarkable canvases, provocative canvases that brought the provincial life, or the life of the painter, into the realm of high art in Paris. And as such, they caused a great stir. What they did was to represent the provincial bourgeoisie, performing its, and working class, performing their simple rituals. For example, the Burial at Rouen consisted of a group of rural bourgeois who were simply assisting, performing, participating in a funeral. The way they were presented, the kind of raw realism with which they were featured, without any attempt at composing them in some meaningful arrangement, without any attempt to endow them with expressive faces. They simply confronted the viewer as they were, as it were, and as such was a great shock. The style of Courbet was also provincial, one can say. It was not a style, it was a new kind of realism, very different from the realism of his peers. Unlike, for example, someone like Jean-François Millet, who ennobled his depiction of French peasants by figuring them as Michelangelesque figures in order to speak of their labor in kind of positive terms. Courbet did nothing of the kind. He stayed away from echoing any tradition and instead offered a kind of raw depiction of reality, which at the same time forced people to rethink it rather than to admire it or feel ennobled by it. And these kinds of depictions participated in the provocative persona that Courbet adopted for himself. As John Berger called it, the persona of a vertical invader. Someone who came from the rural area of Franche-Comté to Paris, and instead of trying to pass, to fit in, deliberately defined himself as a provincial in a provocative way. And these paintings were essential for the construction of this persona. Now, much ink has been spilled on these paintings. They are, the canonical masterpieces of Courbet. Paul stays away from them. He does not really, he chose not to engage with these canvases and instead focused on landscapes, which are well known, of course, and there exists a scholarship on them, but they are far less understood. He focuses on landscape in order to reassess its position, both in Courbet's oeuvre, but also in the project of modern painting. And his argument is that it is precisely in landscapes that lies Courbet's contribution to modern art. The reassessment is based on a number of things, chief among them a new discussion of the materiality of painting. Question of materiality, I would say, in these paintings. That is, first of all, how Courbet paints, and this is a stunning new detailed account of Courbet's procedures, one that debunks a lot of myths about it, including, for example, the way in which he used a palette knife. But at the same time, it is irreducible to just the way in which, to paint, the pictorial mode of Courbet. It is materiality understood also as related to the substance of things that are being represented. And what Galvez argues is that the mode of painting is, as he puts it, co-substantial with the matter of things depicted in it. It is a very provocative argument in and of itself, and it is very interestingly contextualized as well, and we'll talk about it a little bit, I hope. The bottom line is that through this original mode of depiction, Courbet engages with the idea of origins, the origins of landscape, the geological origins of the world, but also the origins of painting. And it is as such that he sees these works as absolutely crucial for the generation of painters who came after Courbet, who knew him, who were for a time being for a certain amount of time contemporaneous with him, such as Impressionists and especially Cézanne. So there is also a reassessment of that generation. Now, what I think we should do is to focus on a number of specific issues that this book raises. But what I would like to begin with is a question that I think a lot of readers, most of the readers, want to be answered. Namely, how did this book come about? How did you get interested in the subject of Courbet's landscapes, and why? And how does your approach, as you developed it, differ from that of other scholars who have dealt with it?
Thank you, Ewa, for the generous introduction. I know who have ghostwrite my next book. And thank you to Dorothea von Moltke and Lavin Books, of course, for hosting this wonderful event. So the story of how I came to this subject. Well, it, like many topics that you work on, comes from your years as a graduate student. And at first I was studying post-war art, post-war 20th century art. And being in Europe that year, I decided I would back up my art historical education and go to Germany and do a museum blitz from Hamburg down the Rhine to Basel to see every museum containing modern art along that route, which had the advantage you could maximize your day passes by staying 2 or 3 in the same day. What surprised me is that in almost every one, there was one of Courbet's landscapes, and not just a minor one, but a major one. And to see them over and over again, and to look at them very closely, I was shocked, because this is not the Courbet, as Eva mentions, that you learn in Art History 101, which are the large figure paintings. So that was the first thing that was striking about them. The second is that when I got up to them closely to look at them, because I'm interested in painterly technique, I noticed that it was not at all how he's depicted in the caricatures of the time and in subsequent art history. He is known for using a palette knife, which is a tool used to mix paint on a board before being applied to canvas. And it typically has a metal blade of varying length. And it's used most often to fill in backgrounds very quickly, in addition to mixing paint. Courbet was famous in his own time for painting like a mason, like a bricklayer. So in theory, when you go up to his paintings, you expect to see a thick relief like none you'd ever seen before in the history of art. So going close to these paintings and trying to find this famous palette knife technique, I noticed that, in fact, quite the opposite. The layers were slimmed, which is to say that they were thick enough that you could see individual touches, but not so thick that they were bulging off the canvas in the overly dramatic way. And in fact, they were put down in layers, no more than 3 usually, which created the illusion of thickness that you can see from far away as well as up close. So this was puzzling to me. So I put it in my mental bank as something to look for. And when I went through the Courbet literature, I noticed that even in the specialized studies of the landscapes, there weren't that many at the time, there was no lengthy discussion of what he was most famous for, one of the things he was most famous for, which is this technique. Which means that entire corpus about this artist was wrong. At least that's how I saw it then, and actually how I see it now. The other thing, and this gets to the issue of the co-substantiality of image and matter, is that when I got up close to the paintings, I was expecting the various trees and waves that are in Courbet's landscapes to eventually, for the illusion to eventually fail, and that I would see just paint. And what I noticed, like, once again, I did not see in other paintings of the time, is that the image maintained its representational quality even when you got up close. So, for instance, if you saw a wave and you went forward to look at the foam, it still looked rather foamy, even though you were up close to the painting. And that's because paint, as a unctuous, oily substance, oftentimes has the same physical properties as the materials painted in Courbet's painting. So, in other words, what you're looking at and what is used to represent it are the same thing for this moment, the moment of looking. And that moment extends for far longer than in other artist work of the time. And so this dilatory effect, which is one of the striking things about these landscapes, you want to stand in front of them for a long time and look at all these details. This temporality that is extended has to do with the fact that the illusion does not fail until a much longer time than is normal. So those two issues, really the collapse of form and matter in painting, and his technique drove me to make that the subject of a dissertation. And after a long break, I finally got to bring it into fruition as a book. So that is the story.
Wonderful. I want to engage with a key aspect that you just described. But what came to my mind is a question that I actually asked myself as I was reading it and admiring your incredibly inquisitive discussion of technique. Have you painted yourself?
I have tried, and you really appreciate how difficult it is to be a painter when you try to do it yourself as a self-taught artist, like Gauguin, for instance. He was much better, but he had Pissarro as his teacher. And I did not even get to the laying stage, because simply mixing colors to get the right hue and value was a nightmare. And I didn't have the patience to mix the colors. So from the very beginning, I could not replicate what Courbet was doing. But you could play around with a palette knife and try various effects. So yes and no.
Good, so I'm in good company. I painted one oil painting in my life, and only because I was ashamed by not finishing it. But I thought it was exceedingly boring enterprise. And you know, if you don't have a particular mimetic skill, and I didn't, I just you learn things. But I thought it was just excruciating. And the sense that word you use, patience, is really something that rarely comes to mind as we walk through the museum halls and look at these paintings. So think about it. Patience. Well, so I wanted, you know, you said something really, really interesting about the effect of Courbet, namely that you come close and it doesn't really dissolve. The illusion doesn't dissolve. You have the materiality. This runs against the whole tradition of commenting, of painting and commenting on paintings who were doing similar, and painters who were doing similar things as Courbet. There is a famous dictum of Diderot, which you surely know, who describes one of his favorite 18th century painters, someone who is dear to my 18th century heart, namely Jean-Baptiste Chardin, who was, like Courbet, a master of the material, and who also had this kind of quasi-geological approach to painting by layering, you know, the canvas with series of different kinds of pigments that created a surface that produced this effect of mysterious depth, kind of deep materiality, which wasn't visible. It definitely wasn't accessible, but you could feel it. There was a kind of, you know, inaccessibility and interiority to it that had something to do with the way in which Chardin thought of himself as a painter. He was a craftsman, trained as a craftsman, but he wanted to occupy a position in the high echelons of art. And he was a painter of very lowly subjects, still lifes, and he did succeed. He became known as, you know, while painting still lifes and not history painting or any other subjects that were considered at that time as important, he was considered to be the best painter of his time. And Diderot, who was one of the commentators who praised him highly, has this phrase about his painter, Chardin, the magician. He says, you know, you stay at some distance from a painting, everything gels, it's fantastic. You come close, there's nothing but pigment. It makes no sense, you know? So this is what you have just said. I just wanted to notice that this is not usual. Normally, you know, you lose sense of illusion. So there is this very particular aspect that you have. I have to say that you are the one who brought it up for the first time, as far as I know. But of course, what you insist on is that materiality is not just that, but there is something else to it. And materiality, for those of you who are not art historians, is like one of the hottest terms in the discipline right now, and in the humanities at large. People started paying more and more attention to how things are made or painted, and what does it mean? Which is the key thing. That is the question of meaning of materiality. And you have argued for it beautifully by raising this question of the materiality of things that are depicted and the means that are used to depict them. And I want you to tell us a little more about that, and especially of your very sharp and original contextualization of it. You end up with this argument of the origins, and I want you to focus on that notion for us. Why origins? And how does materiality produce this originary dimension, these paintings? What does it all mean?
Okay, I'm going to break that one down into two parts. There's the issue of, let's call it, the traditional flatness of the image in Western painting. from the Renaissance to the 19th century. And then there's the question of origins. So the first topic, I'm glad you mentioned the buzzword of materiality, because in the introduction to the book, I make it explicitly clear that I'm never going to use that word in the entire book. And I think I stick to that. Why? Well, I noticed in a lot of the discourse about materiality in art history that it's used to describe many discontinuous things. For instance, sometimes it is used to talk about objects because they are made of materials and they're three-dimensional and therefore not two-dimensional. And so the materiality of it, the physicality of it is obvious and you can trace it. Then there's a second mode that comes up in the discourse on materiality, and that is what, in the circumstances of the art historical period you are looking at, of a textual trace of a discussion of materials. So ivory in medieval manuscripts, or the use of slate in Titian. And the meaning of the materials in that sense is just attributed to whatever is said in the text. And the negotiation from text to image is very one-to-one and I would say oversimplified and not as nuanced as it could be. Then there is a more philosophical discussion of the form-matter distinction, and that shows up in many different places and is a discussion that is, couldn't even be treated in one book. But you often find references from everything from Marx to Freud to, well, it's embarked in my book. And the way I wanted to approach this issue is that I wanted to focus on painting, the painting that is flat, precisely because it is the medium and the genre that is not discussed in a lot of this art history about materiality, except for exceptional books like Ewa Lajer-Burcharth on 18th century painting. And there's a good reason for that, because the material and physical aspects of oil painting were repressed by the tradition, art historians have continued that by not talking about it. And Courbet, as I was saying earlier, is the artist who brings matter into the framework as something that is part of the image, that the form-matter distinction is fundamental to any representation. So at a very, very basic level, and now we're switching a bit to origins, how a figure is conjured from a material is at the heart of the process of representation. So it gets to really one of the fundamental issues about representation as a practice. Now, the question of origins.
Can I just interrupt for a second to anchor you in something that might be helpful? You begin the book with this incredible, do we have the book? With this incredible depiction, discussion of the painting, which is the source of the river Louis, I think. Is that the one? Fragonard, sorry.
Eva, can you speak again?
Sorry. Okay, so we begin with this painting. And the way he describes it pulls you in this space entirely. Of course, this is a reproduction, so you don't have the experience of how it matters. And this, this is, of course, pulls you into the very origin, the source of literally of the stream, but also, in a sense, to the origins of painting. And so I think that might kind of anchor, help you with making that connection quickly, right?
Yes. Shall I talk about the writing then a little bit, since you brought it up? It does have to do with how you translate visual experience.
Absolutely. This was my last question to you about writing, but we already discussed it right now.
One of the main issues I wanted to convey, or aspect of my book, come across for not just Courbet studies, but for the field of the history of European painting, is to have a long, one could say, loving description of an artwork that somehow, in language, captures the experience of looking at it. So in Courbet's case, because the image of the painting demands that you look at it for a long time, you have to describe it for a relatively long time on the page. So oftentimes I spend entire paragraphs discussing the way it's painted. Now, there's a danger in that. There's a kind of empty formal description that just describes things to give local color. So the second aspect that I had to convey was that this wasn't an arbitrary description, but paid close attention to substances, using a lot of adjectives and verbs that evoke materials, and to also convey that time is passing in a different way, almost that you have to enter another world entirely, as if you're going back to the origins of the world. And so for Courbet, the way to capture that was to paint things like caves, riverbeds that have no sunlight, waves that are in your face, a forest where the undergrowth is so dense that you can't really see past a certain point. So that's what I wanted to say about
it. It's wonderful. I love that. You do produce that effect of the time slowing down. This difficult rhetorical move, but you do absolutely succeed in it. Okay, I want to now move on to something that's related to that experience, namely to the question of the body. This is a very bodily painting. I mean, the very substance of paint is incredibly corporeal, right? And the way in which you enter that cave makes you feel as if you were entering some kind of bodily interiority. Now, you engage with this question of the body in a very interesting way. What you say is that Courbet's paintings are not bodies, as it has often been claimed. They instead are testimonies to a certain corporeal experience. And that becomes very provocative, especially in the last chapter, which is titled beautifully, "The Milk of the Sea," which is not some kind of fancy rhetorical figure. It's actually taken from Michelet and his description of the sea. And there you make that statement about, we should actually, can you see the wave and then the woman in the waves?
Will you tell us the page number, Paul, when you get
Sure.
it?
Sure. So this is page, I don't have my reading glasses on, so I'm having trouble the number.
Is it by that reading glasses? It's page 191. There is this beautiful description of the corporeality of the image. You said it's a corporeality in the absence of the body. And you give this description of the sea as being this kind of environment that is extremely sumptuously, I think is the word you use.
What page is this? Sorry.
Material.
191. 191.
No.
131?
Hold on. 110.
110, sorry.
Oh,
We
sorry.
can look at paintings, but not
No, actually, 110 is A.
No, I think, okay, let me look again, because I want you to see that. Okay, it's illustration number 42, 101. At second try. Is that possible?
Yes.
Okay, that's better. So, I mean, you can see this. There is a wave coming forward, and, you know, there is no resolution here. It doesn't really, you know, amount to anything narratively identifiable. It doesn't signal danger. It is vaguely, you know, kind of encompassing, maybe even encroaching upon your space, but it's not literal in any way. It's just what it is. A lot of water churning about, right? And a lot of paint used to depict that sense of material presence. So you talk about it beautifully as a kind of, you know, what these paintings do is to immerse you in that layer, in these layers of sumptuous substance, of sumptuous materiality, very varied, you know, as the particles of the sea, the foam, the kind of denser area, matter of the waves, and the more transparent area of the unagitated sea, etc., etc. And you say, you know, one feels as if completely, you know, immersed in it, as if in a kind of unclaustrophobic or non-claustrophobic womb. And you begin there, you engage there a kind of a category of the womb which comes up actually quite often with Courbet, both when in relation to those cavernous landscape of the region from which he came, the Franche-Comté, as well as in relation to other paintings, and, you know, he himself literally represented, maybe not a womb, but definitely the genital area of a woman that is focused upon without any other parts of the body being visible, which is called the origins of the world. So the womb is, you know, tossed about the waves of scholarship on Courbet. But you were trying, and you're very militant in the introduction, to keep away from this literalness of the body, because what's at stake in Courbet is a different kind of corporeality, the one that cannot be reduced to a bodily part. Nonetheless, you bring that womb and that kind of disorienting experience, which you like, though. You don't think of it as unpleasant.
Something there's almost as if there's no stable ground.
Right,
And
exactly.
those layers of paint are actual layers of the world. There's no thing to anchor you, and certainly with the sea, that is the case.
Right. So one wonders, you know, what kind of body is this disembodied? You know, what sort of corporeality? How one can relate to? Can one at all relate to any human body or not? You seem not willing to do that, and yet, of course, you have to discuss a painting which does precisely that, which is the woman in the waves. Very strange.
The page, what's the number?
And that, well, let me tell you, it seems to be 127. Right? And the number of illustration is 56.
Yes.
Now, so what you use this painting for is to state that, you know, there is in Michelet's text about the sea, and he calls it kind of maternal, he speaks of maternal contours. And in Courbet, there is a kind of implicit femininity of this corporeality, not the body, but the corporeality, right? So here it is, you've got a woman, this is it. This is just, you know, like, if one can say so, literal allegory, which is a contradiction in terms, but never mind. You know, I wonder what do you make of it? What I want to notice is how strange is this? Because all nudes of Courbet are very strange. They're so materially present, they gesture incomprehensibly. Delacroix famously said, "What is this all about? I cannot understand it, what this bather is doing." But this particular one introduces this femininity, this maternal contours. Her breast is very prominent, not the womb, not in view. But it is very strange. These breasts have a kind of gelatinous quality. They also look as if they were coming from another body attached to it. Did you notice that?
Courbet was not a great painter of the nude figure.
Right. Well, in any case, so all of this, to think of this, it's a very beautiful kind of Deleuzian formulation, right? A kind of body experience with which you end without the body there. But one wonders, if it could be gendered, if it could be related to some form of social experience rather than only conceptual or literary experience. What do you think?
I think it can. But I want to contextualize a bit the landscapes vis-a-vis the nudes, because I think that's important to bring up. These landscapes are made in bursts of energy, usually a couple of months long. Usually in the summer or the off-season when he's not painting for the salon. When he paints for the salon, that's when he goes into figurative mode, including nudes. So it's almost like he bracketed in his mind and in his practice two different modes. There's the landscape mode, which is the corporeality in the absence of a body, which I'm glad that Ava brought up. And then there is the figuration that goes back to allegorical tropes and the nude figure as the classic image of beauty, and these naughty pictures that he painted for rich people's boudoirs. And there he adapts some of these landscape elements, but mixes them in with, for instance, women in the waves. In the book, as Eva points out, I'm rather militant against anthropomorphic readings of the landscapes. And that image of the woman in the waves is, in fact, precisely what Courbet is not doing in the big wave paintings, which indeed are very unsettling. You would think, oh, this is the emptiest painting ever, but at the same time, it's also the fullest in terms of how the clouds and the waves and the sand feel in your face. And that's another thing about the wave. If you actually try to imagine yourself at the beach and putting yourself in the point of view of someone looking at a Courbet wave, you couldn't do it. Because you would either have to be far away enough to see the wave in its entirety, or rather close to feel the foam in your face. And that is precisely why a critic like Walter Benjamin later would say that this was a painting that tried to do something photographic before photography, before the freeze frame and the close-up and the zoom. Going back to the question of anthropomorphism, I guess it came out of a certain frustration that whenever I would say I was working on this topic, people would say, and what are you going to say about l'origine du monde? And indeed, that is one of the major readings of the caves, which can be made. I mean, there's certainly, in the time, an association of caverns and the female body, certainly. But I thought that Courbet's approach added a layer on top of that, or multiple layers, if you want to take it literally. And that's that it's almost like you're surrounded by human tissue that hasn't coalesced into a body. And that's what I'm calling corporeality, in the absence of a body. I did try to find actual body parts and fragments in the stone surfaces of those landscapes, and I did not succeed. So if someone else can, then they can disagree with my anti-anthropomorphic view. And you mentioned Deleuze. The key figure, the kind of breakthrough figure in my mind in talking about this topic was Roland Barthes. In his book, Nishide, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. It's written in fragments, and each part has a theme, and substance is one of those themes. The sea is another. There's many others. And what Courbet does is that he identifies these themes not as the major subject of Michelet's writings, but something that appears everywhere, whether he's talking about nature, whether he's talking about the French Revolution, whether he's talking about Napoleon, or insects, which are all genres he wrote in. And this constant repetition of corporeal or substantive language runs like a undercurrent throughout his writing. And since many of the passages on the sea in Barthes are almost perfect descriptions of the waves, in my mind thought, well, is the representation of matter in Courbet also acting like a thematic leitmotif that shows up in various places, and especially places where you don't expect, but also it's underground, so to speak, because the thing about the theme is that sometimes it declares itself and sometimes it's in the background, but it's always there. And that gave me a way of thinking about how certain figurative paintings will have this approach to the body within them, but not being the major focus. And it's something I think Courbet, without psychoanalyzing him, was drawn to being almost physically in contact with painterly materials and couldn't avoid, at some point, putting them in his paintings. So that's
right. I guess one can say that what you were very wary of was the collapsing of the idea of corporeality, or the idea of just certain paintings that he produced onto other paintings which were done for different purpose, as the origins of the world was. It was, very important but pornographic painting made for a private patron. It's not the same as the landscape. So I think you're trying to pull these two apart to prevent them from being collapsed onto one another. It's too quick. I think.
By the way, that painting only received the title L'Origine du Monde much later. So, in fact, it's almost an indirect way of showing how Courbet was associated with origins, because they were associated retrospectively with that figure.
Yeah, it's useful to keep in mind that paintings are done for different patrons, different occasions, and that has to be taken into account. I very much like your discussion of Michelet and the way you pull him in very unexpected ways through Barthes. That allows you, among other things, to think of landscapes as historical composition through the notion of substance, which is how Michelet understands history. Wonderful. And I also like what you call the episodic structure of your book, which brings us to perhaps the last question that I would like to, or issue that I would like to raise, namely the book as a kind of adventure in writing. You mentioned already the way in which Barthes inspired you. You have adopted episodic structure divided into 3 periods of Courbet's intense engagement with landscape that are discontinuous, in a sense, mirroring his practice. And I wondered whether, since the book is really written in extraordinarily compelling way, very eloquent and elegant, whether Courbet was in some ways an inspiration for the very rhetoric of your writing, or was he precisely the opposite of your, fleshed out arguments about his work? What's the relation between the mode of writing, the rhetorics, and the way in which Courbet paints? Is there any, or?
I don't know if anything Courbet said or did inspired my writing, but what people said about landscape and substance did. Going back to the question we started with, I wanted to somehow capture that feeling of surprise and the phenomenology of looking and the duration and the technique, and all in one go. And so the descriptive mode for me allowed that. Also, in terms of the field of 19th century art history, which is in many ways iconographic. It looks at a painting, identifies who and what is represented by going to the archive and pulling that information out, which has been incredibly fertile for not just 19th century art history, but for the discipline itself. Precisely because these are often textually based, I wanted to start with the object, the image, and make the reader have to be there as long as I was, at least to some degree. I think that in terms of writing, at least for the descriptions, that Barthes and Michelet were very much models in the way they use language. And this is hard to describe, but the way that phrases and words are used in those books in French is incredibly beautiful, and many metaphors and words for oil and cream appear in many different ways, as adjectives, nouns, verbs. And so it's always there and creating these surprising juxtapositions, images you would never think about, like oily.
The milk of the sea as well.
Yeah,
definitely.
As far as the episodic structure, one thing I do want to mention, because 1/4 of the book is about it, is that it was very important for me to at least end with the legacy of Courbet, and particularly the palette knife technique, on the Impressionists, and particularly Cézanne, who actually is the artist who painted like a mason. Those portraits of Alcoboni from 1866 are the thickest paintings in the history of European art up until that point, and out of nowhere, except from Courbet. So the structure very much wanted to lay the foundations for how this technique gets transformed, and the question of the origin gets, in a way, co-opted and transformed by Cézanne and Pissarro in their 1870 landscapes, when they themselves start using the palette knife after almost 7 years of not using it at all. And then the ending shows that this intrusive approach to materiality becomes really fundamental for the great Cézannes, where the ground actually shows itself, and the covering of the image is not complete. So I wanted to point the way to how you eventually get to Cubism from Courbet's landscapes. So they're originary in that sense as well, that the problem of the origin originates itself with Courbet.
That's a good
place to land, yeah.
good
Maybe
place
I'll
to
take
end,
my
right?
mic to around, and you guys
And
can
open.
and we'll open it up
discussion.
to questions from here. Questions from here.
That's fascinating. How do you get to Cubism from Courbet's landscapes? I have many questions, but I had to ask.
I could say you have to wait for my next book.
Yeah.
But, well, I began to answer that question with the adoption of the palette knife in Cézanne and Pissarro in the 1870s. One of the interesting things about the 1860s is Cézanne also painted the wall of the studio. So he was already from the very beginning interested in the actual thickness of the medium, but also its physical support. And when you get to watercolors, where it's not clear in the composition what is meant to be the background or the foreground and what is meant to be transparent or solid, he's going back and forth on this divide between form and matter that Courbet really raised as an issue, because his paintings make matter present. Cézanne in particular is very important for that, because by and large, the Impressionists were, of course, figurative, and this temporality is not really what they're interested in. They're much more interested in the pace of modern life. It's quick and fast and goes by in the blink of an eye, and is often with other people. Whereas Courbet, really, you feel in total solitude. So with Cézanne, forget what I was saying.
Painting the wall.
Oh yes. He brought the form-matter distinction to consciousness in a way, and then once he did, art never went back to painting flat with glazes and hiding the material. Even if you wanted to do even salon impressionists used it. I mean, it became really the norm, the new norm. But someone had to bring it up as an issue, and the Impressionists took it and ran away with it. Now, when you get to Cubism, interestingly enough, material does come back, but as one sign amongst many other in a grid. So once you get to Duchamp, the materiality becomes something else altogether. But it was not overnight. There had to be a sequence of steps.
I'm presuming that Monet had some influence on the way he painted, but also it seems as though there's some influence of people like Constable with his landscapes and Turner with the sea motifs. I don't know if you see anything in that.
Turner is an artist that I would have loved to do more with. But to address that here, you would really have to get into British landscape painting and his own mode of painting the sea with heavy impasto, which comes from a different place. The reception of Turner and Constable in France is an interesting one. Constable showed in the 1820s, but if you look at the collections at the Louvre, for instance, there's hardly any Constable in Turner. They were almost known more as the English landscapist rather than having their paintings around to look at and copy. So they were almost mythic figures. Constable's interesting because he doesn't use the palette knife to do this layering effect of dilate time. It's more about adding accents in different parts of the composition such that one of his studies at the same scale of one of his larger landscapes is just as finished as the other one. So he kind of collapses the gap between study and final image, which is different from Courbet. So I would say actually it's more the French Romantic landscape painters who are his immediate contemporaries that he was looking at.
Maybe I'll ask a question and we can see if there's another question in the room. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. I was wondering, we were talking earlier about the colors of the cover of the book, and it's worth saying how beautifully produced it is. And I was wondering if you wanted to say something at all about the unusually dark palette of the paintings and what work it maybe does for Courbet in relation to things like the maintenance of the illusion that you talked about, or the destabilization that the viewer can experience, or anything else that these dark hues work that those do.
Maybe Eva could talk about Chardin because the backgrounds are very interesting there as well. But for the Courbet part, I have to thank my editors at Yale in London, who pushed me to go with this design after an initial reluctance. Courbet's images are notoriously hard to reproduce because they are so dark. And the technology has gotten to the point where you can do a pretty good job of showing gestures and gradations of color and darkness in an art history book. for instance, the paper that was used is neither totally shiny nor totally matte. Shininess usually was used to have great saturation in images, but you sacrifice legibility because when you try to read, you have to move your book around at different angles because the glare would block the text. The opposite direction, to use matte paper, was great for reading text, but weakened the image. So the paper used in this book is actually ink deposited on the surface of a matte paper, a semi-matte paper, so that it doesn't absorb fully, which is what lessens it in terms of image quality. And the other thing, which I think other books are doing now, is that it doesn't have a book jacket. It's printed directly on a hardcover in a yellow, bright yellow color. I don't know if that's a trend. They don't want to do book flaps anymore, but it does make it very handy. You can grab it and you're not going to grab the book flap falling over. And in terms of your other question about the grounds, what's interesting about Courbet is that those backgrounds almost never read these landscapes as the back wall of what you're looking at, place that the image stops. It always looks like there's more forms out there in the darkness. You just have to keep moving closer and closer because as you go step by step, there's another layer. So I call it asymptotic. You get closer and closer, but you don't quite get to the origin. And my take, therefore, on the origin is that you never quite get there. It's always a process. Because if you got there, then the whole experience would be over.
That also feels like a good last sentence, a good end to a complex comment on origins. This has been a really lovely conversation. I want to thank both of you very much, and please, all of you, join me in doing that.
Thank you.